The sun was low when Elias Crowe rode into town, his horse limping through the dust, his rifle older than his hope. Inside the trading post, a drunken trader shoved forward a scarred young woman, her tattooed wrist caught like a shackle. The townsfolk turned their faces, but Elias could not. He knew that mark. It had once saved his life. His voice cut the silence, steady as steel. "Stop, I'll buy her." The horse limped beneath him, each step a reminder that time had not been kind to either beast or man. Elias Crowe rode into the settlement at dusk, his silhouette trailing long across the dirt street. The town was quiet, though smoke curled from a few chimneys and the smell of boiled beans hung in the air. He shifted in the saddle, feeling the ache in his back, the stiff pull of old scars hidden beneath his coat. Once he had ridden into towns like this with laughter waiting, with a wife's voice promising warmth. Those days were gone. All that remained was the rifle slung behind his shoulder and the silence that clung to him like dust. The trading post. Door banged open as he dismounted. Inside, lantern light flickered on shelves of flour, beans, and worn tools. The air smelled of tobacco and damp leather. Elias had come for coffee and nails, maybe salt pork if he had coin enough. But what met his ears was not the rhythm of commerce. It was argument. At the counter stood a man bloated with drink, his voice thick with cruelty. He held the arm of a young woman as if she were no more than livestock. Her eyes, dark and steady, betrayed no plea, though her skin bore scars that spoke of long roads and hard exile. Around her wrist was a faint tattoo, inked in a pattern Elias recognized in a way that stole his breath. "I'll trade her," the man sneered to the shopkeep, who shifted uncomfortably, worth less than a mule, but a mouth less to feed. No one met the woman's gaze. The few townsfolk present busied themselves with shelves and sacks, pretending they hadn't heard. Elias felt the old rage stir, the kind he had buried. When he buried his wife, he told himself to walk away. He needed no more burdens. But the tattoo gleamed in the lamplight. Years ago, on a mountain pass slick with snow and blood, he had fallen beneath the rifles of men who had no mercy. A hand had dragged him from that place, wrapped in shadows, leaving him alive when he should have died. The last thing he remembered, before darkness, was that mark upon a wrist vanishing into the storm. He stepped forward, his voice carrying the weight of something irrevocable. "Stop," he said, his tone flat as stone. "I'll buy her." The drunkard blinked, then barked a laugh, but Elias did not flinch. He laid silver on the counter, more than the man deserved, less than the woman's dignity. The transaction ended in silence. The trader staggered away, coin clinking, and the townsfolk still refused to meet Elias's eyes. The woman did not thank him. She did not resist when he led her outside, but neither did she walk close. She moved like someone prepared to flee, though the weight of exhaustion held her shoulders low. They rode together through the fading light, the prairie stretching out in waves of dry grass. The wind smelled of sage and coming frost. Elias's homestead stood at the edge of nowhere, a cabin weathered to gray, its roof sagging but still holding. The corral leaned like an old man. The fields lay bare, abandoned to weeds. Inside, the air was colder than the dusk. Shadows hung heavy across the wooden beams, and the rocking chair by the fire, once his wife's seat, waited empty, the shawl still draped across its back. He set down his rifle, lit a lantern, and let its glow push back the dark. The woman stood by the doorway, silent, her hands folded tightly before her. Her eyes swept the room as if measuring every shadow for betrayal. "You can sit," Elias said, his voice low, but she did not move. He poured water into a kettle, set it over the fire. The crackle of flame was the only answer between them. At last she crossed the room and lowered herself near the hearth, but not to the chair. Instead, she settled on the floorboards, her back against the wall, as though she expected the door to open and drag her away again. Elias watched her, the way she held herself rigid, the way her eyes never closed. "Ayana," she said finally, her voice barely more than a whisper. He nodded once, acknowledging her name without pressing for more. Names were powerful things. Sometimes silence guarded them better than words. The kettle hissed. He poured 2 tin cups of hot water darkened by coffee grounds and set one near her hand. She did not drink. Night pressed in against the cabin walls. The fire cast long shadows over the tools hanging by the door, over the rifle resting within reach. Elias sat in the other chair, staring into the flames, hearing the echo of his wife's voice that would never return. He had thought himself done with companionship, done with the raw ache of loss. Yet here was this woman, marked by the same tattoo that had once saved his life. He could not explain it, only feel the weight of it settling into his bones. She did not thank him. She did not trust him. She only watched him from across the firelight, her silence heavier than words. And Elias, staring at the shadows crawling the walls, realized he had not rescued her from loneliness. He had only brought it home to dwell beside his own. The days that followed were quiet, though not with peace. Silence in that cabin had a weight to it, a kind that pressed against Elias Crowe's chest like the memory of a hand that would never touch him again. He woke at dawn as always, pulling, on boots hardened by years of wear, stepping out into the gray prairie light. The fences sagged in places where wind had leaned too long, and he set about repairing them, driving nails into warped boards, testing posts with the stubbornness of a man who knew wood would always outlast flesh. From the house came no sound but the faint stirring of embers coaxed to life. When he returned at noon, sweat drying on his brow, Ayanna was there by the hearth, her long hair spread like a dark river over her shoulder as she wove it into braids, each strand twisted with patient fingers, the motion slow, deliberate, ritual. He stood a moment watching the braids take form, symbols perhaps of something he did not understand. Lunch passed without words. He ate at the table, the tin, fork scraping against his plate. She sat on the floor near the fire, her meal taken separately as though a boundary had been drawn in ash between them. When his eyes strayed to her, she met them with calm defiance, not hostility but distance, as though daring him to demand closeness she would never grant. Evenings fell colder, the prairie wind slipping through chinks in the walls despite his efforts. Elias sat with his boots by the fire, sharpening his old knife on a whetstone, watching sparks dance in the hearth. Across from him, Ayanna sat still, her shadow tall against the logs. Sometimes she touched the rocking chair, her fingers trailing along the curve of the wood. It had been his wife's chair, the place where she nursed warmth into the cabin with her voice and her knitting, her shawl ever draped across its back. Now Ayanna's gaze lingered there as if she could hear the echoes too, and Elias's chest tightened with something he could neither welcome nor banish. He dreamt, those nights, of the ambush. Snow drifting like ash across a mountain pass, rifles barking in the dark, his horse collapsing beneath him. He remembered the sharp pain in his side, the taste of blood in his mouth, and the cold certainty that no one would find him. But then, hands unseen, pulling him into shadows, dragging him across stone. He had faded into unconsciousness, but before the blackness closed he had seen it. The tattoo, a mark coiled on the wrist of his savior. That same mark now lived on the woman who sat across his fire, silent as death, braiding her hair. During the day, Elias tried to work away the memories. He mended tools long rusted, straightened a plow he hadn't used in years, stacked wood for a winter he feared would be harsher than the last. Still, she was always there, not in his way, not intruding, but ever present, like the sound of a distant river one could not escape. She swept the cabin floor with a bundle of sage-tied sticks, the scent filling the air with something older than the house itself. She stitched torn fabric with thread she carried in a small pouch. Her movements were quiet, self-contained, yet everything she touched seemed marked with a fragile claim of survival. At times, when the light slanted just so, Elias caught sight of scars on her arms, pale ridges against her skin as though her life had been carved by knives the world never saw. They were not only scars of the body. He saw it in her eyes too, in the way she glanced at the door whenever footsteps sounded from the road, in the way her shoulders stiffened at the distant laughter of men. One night, as wind rattled the shutters, Elias asked without turning his head, "You had family?" His voice was low, More statement than question. Ayana did not answer. She sat by the fire, braiding. The strands twisted and locked, her fingers moving faster as though binding her silence tighter. When at last she looked up, her gaze was steady, but behind it he saw rejection so deep it had settled like frost inside her. Rejection from her people, perhaps. Rejection from the settlers. Rejection from a world that had no place for her but the corner of his hearth. Elias said nothing more. He turned back to the fire, listening to the knife scrape stone, each stroke sharp as memory. Yet he began to notice the small things. How she paused before eating, whispering words in her own tongue. How she brushed snow from the doorstep with care as if keeping the threshold sacred. How she placed his wife's shawl gently across the chair each night, though she never once tried to wear it. The shadows grew long inside him. He carried loneliness like a wound, sharp and unhealed. But he began to see that her shadows were older, deeper. She was not merely a reminder of his survival on that mountain pass. She was someone who had walked through exile and still remained upright. One evening, after a long day of mending fence wire, Elias sat with his rifle across his knees, oiling the barrel. Ayana braided her hair, her hands slow, her eyes far away. The firelight caught her tattoo, glimmering faintly. He thought of the stranger's hands that had once dragged him from death, of the way he had lived only because of someone's mercy. Now across the fire sat the proof of that mercy, scarred and silent, carrying her own wilderness inside her. The rocking chair creaked as the wind brushed the house, though no one sat in it. Elias set the rifle aside, rubbed his scarred side, through his shirt and breathed in the smoke. He did not speak aloud, the realization forming in him, but it was there. This woman was more than a shadow of his past. She bore wounds deeper than his own, wounds that made his grief seem almost merciful. And if he had thought himself the one offering her refuge, he began to suspect it was the other way around, that her presence was forcing him to reckon with a loneliness he had too long mistaken for strength. The storm came sudden, rolling across the prairie like a living beast. By dusk the horizon was black with clouds, their bellies split by jagged light. Elias had seen such storms before, and he knew they came with a vengeance. He barred the door, set heavy stones against the shutters, and laid kindling thick in the hearth. By the time the rain arrived, it was a hammering that shook the cabin walls. Wind howled like wolves through the cracks. The roof groaned beneath the weight of water. Elias sat with his rifle across his knees, his fingers tracing the metal, though his grip felt clumsy, his trust in his own hands worn thin. He did not intend to fire it, not tonight, but holding it was habit, a way to anchor himself against the storm's roar. Ayana moved about the cabin in silence, though her movements carried a rhythm. She filled the kettle with rainwater gathered earlier, placed it over the fire, and watched until steam coiled upward. Coffee grounds scattered into the pot like earth tossed onto a grave. She brewed with care, each motion deliberate, as though the ritual itself warded against the world unraveling outside. They spent the first night without words, the fire their only companion. Elias's eyes drifted often to her silhouette, the braid over her shoulder catching firelight, the tattoo glimmering faintly when her wrist turned. She drank her coffee slowly, her gaze never leaving the storm-shaken shutters, as if listening for something in the wind. On the second day, the rain did not relent. Water seeped through the roof in thin rivulets, dampening the boards. Elias fetched a bucket, set it beneath the dripping place, but the leak grew worse as the hours dragged. By evening, he climbed onto a stool, hammer in hand, while Ayana steadied the wood beneath him. Their hands brushed when she passed him a strip of canvas to patch the gap. The touch was brief, but it lingered longer than the thunder outside. The storm raged louder that night, rattling the walls so fiercely the cabin seemed to breathe. Ayana sat near the fire, whispering in her own tongue. The words rose and fell with the rhythm of the storm, not loud, not desperate, but steady, like prayer carried on wind. Elias did not understand the language, but he felt the weight of it. It was not words meant for him, yet he listened as though they were. Something stirred in him then, not unlike the storm itself, restless, aching, alive. He set aside the rifle, no longer willing to hold it. His hands trembled, whether from age or from memory he could not tell. Instead, he leaned back in the chair and let the fire paint the room in amber. Ayanna finished her whispering, then poured 2 cups of coffee. She placed one near him, and for the first time her eyes lingered on his face without sharpness. There was still distance in her gaze, but it was not contempt. It was caution, worn like armor. Thunder rolled, shaking the roof. Rain lashed against the shutters, harder than before. In the flare of lightning, her face seemed carved from stone, scarred yet unyielding. Elias thought of how long she had carried her silence, how often she had been forced to wear it as a shield. He realized then that her quiet was not disdain. It was survival. She did not speak because words had failed her before. She did not trust them, or the people who demanded them. The night dragged on. The fire crackled low. Elias closed his eyes, drifting between waking and sleep until a sound pulled him back. Not thunder, not rain, but a word. Why? His eyes opened. Ayanna sat across the fire, her braid fallen forward, her hand clenched around her cup. The word hung in the air between them, soft yet heavier than the storm itself. He swallowed, his throat dry. Why what? Her gaze did not waver. Why, me? Elias's mouth opened, then closed again. He had no practiced answer, no words ready for such a question. He stared into the flames, seeing again the snow on the mountains, the blood on his hands, the tattoo disappearing into the storm as a stranger saved his life. At last he said, "Because I recognized what others refused to see." She studied him for a long moment. Then she turned her eyes back to the fire, and though she said nothing more, her shoulders eased just enough that he noticed. The storm thundered on outside, merciless and unbroken. But inside the cabin, in the hush after that single word, the silence had changed. It was still silence, but no longer suffocating. The storm passed as swiftly as it had come, leaving the land washed clean yet brittle. Puddles glittered in wagon ruts. The prairie grass bent low beneath the weight of rain. The sky opened wide again, endless blue over a world that looked the same as before but carried the silence of something broken and remade. Inside the cabin, however, the air grew heavier. Elias rose each morning to the sound of Ayanna moving about with quiet purpose. She had begun to leave her touch upon the house in ways he could not ignore. The hearth swept clean, ashes gathered neatly in a clay pot. His late wife's shawl, once left hanging in faded sorrow, now folded with care across the rocking chair, as though it were still honored. The tools that had rusted in the corner, she rubbed them with oil, set them back to use. Elias felt gratitude stir, but it tangled with guilt. That shawl had belonged to Mary, his wife, whose absence hollowed the house. Each time he saw Ayanna's hands folded, he felt the tug of betrayal, as though loyalty to memory and recognition of the living could not dwell in the same room. He watched her in silence, his jaw tight, his heart unsteady. The town did not help matters. Word spread quick as fire in dry grass. When Elias rode in for nails or salt pork, he felt the stares prick his back. Men who once nodded now looked away. Women whispered behind hands, their eyes flitting toward Ayanna when she trailed him at a distance. They spoke of him buying a woman, as though he had traded coin for flesh, and Elias's pride burned hot with shame. He wanted to spit in the dust and silence them, yet he kept his head down, his silence a shield he knew too well. At night, when the fire sank low, he sat polishing his rifle. The weapon was more rust than shine, but it steadied his hands. Ayanna would sit near the hearth, braiding her hair, her eyes lowered. He wondered if she heard the whispers too, if she carried them like stones in her chest. Days bled into one, another, heavy with unspoken words. Then came the night when silence broke. It was late, the moon high, when the sound of hooves shattered the quiet. Elias rose, heart hammering, and took up his rifle. Shadows staggered at the edge of the yard, 3 men, laughter thick with drink. Their voices carried, crude and careless. "Crowe," one called, his tone mocking. "Heard you got yourself a new wife." Thought we'd come to claim our share. Elias stepped onto the porch, rifle in hand. The men stood swaying near the corral, whiskey glinting in a bottle passed between them. He raised the barrel, steady though his chest burned. "You'll ride on," Elias said, his voice low, the words heavy as lead. The men laughed. One spat in the dirt. "What's the harm, old man? You bought her, didn't you? Ain't yours. To keep." The words struck Elias like blows, pride and shame twisting together. He tightened his grip, ready to fire if he must. The air bristled with violence, the night waiting to break. Then the door behind him opened. Ayanna stepped into the lantern light, her braid falling over her shoulder, her eyes bright as the moon. She moved past Elias without hesitation, her presence stilling even his breath. She faced the men, her voice cutting clear through the night. Words spilled from her in her own tongue, sharp and swift as arrows. Though Elias did not know their meaning, the sound itself carried weight, a command that bent the air. The men faltered, their laughter dying, unease creeping into their faces. Then she spoke again, this time in broken English, her voice steady as stone. "I am not yours, not his, not any man's to trade." The words struck harder than any rifle shot. The drunken bravado faltered. One man cursed, another tugged his horse's reins. Within moments they turned, retreating into the night with muttered threats that carried no teeth. Silence fell heavy after their departure. The prairie wind whispered against the grass, the horses shifting uneasily in the corral. Elias lowered his rifle, the weight of it suddenly too much. He turned toward Ayanna, who still stood tall, her chin lifted, her eyes unbroken. In that moment he saw her differently. Not as someone rescued, not as a burden brought home from pity or memory. She was a fire banked beneath ashes, a strength he had not expected, the same force that had once pulled him from death on a mountain pass. His throat tightened. He realized protection was not his gift alone. She had stood before him, before his rifle, and shielded them both with the courage of her voice. Ayanna looked at him, her eyes softening only a fraction. Then she turned and went back inside, leaving him alone beneath the wide night sky. Elias stood a long time on the porch, the rifle slack in his hands, listening to the quiet that followed danger. The prairie stretched endless before him, but it no longer felt like a place he stood against alone. He had thought himself her protector. Now he knew. She shielded him just as fiercely. The morning after smelled of smoke and damp earth. Ash drifted in faint spirals over the yard, settling like gray snow upon the fences, upon the blackened edges of the cabin where fire had licked but not devoured. The prairie stretched wide and empty again, the silence broken only by the creak of charred boards and the hiss of embers still fading. Elias Crowe stood on the porch with his rifle at his side, though no threat lingered now. The trader and his men were gone, scattered like cowards into the dark, leaving nothing behind but their footprints and the stench of burned pitch. Justice had come not through court or law, but through survival. The only verdict, the frontier. Ayanna moved about the yard with steady steps, her braid falling over her shoulder, her face smudged with soot. She poured water over the last glowing coals, the steam rising in a pale ghost. Her hands bore scrapes, her arms bruises, but her gaze was unbroken. Elias watched her, and for the first time since his wife's passing, he felt something stir inside him that was not grief but strength borrowed from another soul. By midday, he saddled the horses. They rode toward town together, side by side, the prairie wind pulling at their coats. He did not ride ahead of her, nor she behind him. Their silence was no longer sharp, no longer the gulf it once had been. It was the silence of two people who had stood against fire and lived. The town looked smaller than Elias remembered, its streets lined with faces too eager to watch. Men leaned on porch rails, women peered from windows. Whispers traveled quick, but Elias did not bow under them. This time, his pride no longer bent to shame. He dismounted at the store and Ayanna slid down beside him. Together they walked inside, the bell over the door jingling sharp in the hush. The shopkeeper froze, his hands stilling over a stack of flour sacks. Elias's boots struck the floorboards, the sound steady, unyielding. Ayanna walked at his side, her chin lifted, her tattoo visible against the lantern light. No one spoke. No one dared. Elias placed coins on the counter for supplies, nails, bean salt. His hands did not tremble. When he turned to leave, he felt every eye in the room follow, but he no longer carried their judgment. What mattered walked beside him. They rode home in silence. The sun sank low, spilling gold over the prairie. Shadows stretched long, and in them Elias felt no loneliness. The land was vast, but it did not seem empty anymore. That night snow began to fall. Soft flakes drifted over the blackened scars of the cabin, over the ashes that still marked the ground. The fire had left its wounds, but the snow laid a quiet blessing, covering what was broken with gentleness. Elias and Ayanna worked side by side to mend what they could, patching walls, stacking new wood, carrying water from the well. Their movements were slow but sure, each task done together, as if labor itself was a kind of prayer. Later, inside the cabin, the fire burned low. Elias fetched something from the rocking chair, the shawl his wife had left behind, still carrying the faint scent of wool and smoke from years past. He held it a long time, the weight of memory pressing heavy. It was not a gift to give lightly, not a gesture without meaning. At last he stepped toward Ayanna. She looked up at him, her dark eyes steady, waiting. Elias draped the shawl over her shoulders, his hands rough against the fabric. The gesture was not one of replacement, nor of erasure. It was recognition, an offering that she was no longer a stranger in his home, but part of its story now. Ayanna did not smile, nor did she weep. She simply nodded, her braid falling across the shawl like a dark line drawn between past and present. She touched the fabric lightly, as if acknowledging the life that had once warmed it, and then she looked at him. For the first time, Elias felt the weight in his chest ease, as though grief had finally loosened its grip enough to let in something new. The snow thickened outside, blanketing the prairie in white silence. The rocking chair creaked softly as the wind brushed the cabin walls, no longer a sound of absence but of continuity. Elias sat near the fire, his rifle set aside, his shoulders no longer bowed. Ayanna sat across from him, her presence steady, her eyes reflecting the flames. The reckoning had passed, not vengeance, not victory, but survival carried with dignity. What remained was the ride home, not merely to a cabin of wood and stone, but to the fragile, enduring bond that had been forged between them. They did not speak, for words were not needed. In the hush of falling snow, in the glow of firelight, the silence between them was no longer a wall. It was a bridge. The days after the drunken men rode away unfolded differently. The cabin no longer felt like a place split by silence, but like soil where something fragile had begun to grow. Elias noticed it first in the way Ayanna placed 2 plates on the table instead of one. For the first time since she had come under his roof, she sat across from him to eat. Their eyes met above bread and beans, and though no words passed, the act itself was a truce, a declaration that they could share more than firelight. One evening, she began to teach him words from her tongue. She spoke them slowly, her voice hushed but steady, shaping syllables with patient precision. Elias repeated them back, his rough drawl mangling the sounds. She smiled then, not wide, not careless, but the faintest curve of lips, as if a door long closed had cracked open. He felt that smile like warmth after a hard frost. Each word was a seed planted in silence, trust growing where once there had only been stone. In return, Elias told her of his wife. He spoke of Mary's laughter in summer, of her hands weaving cloth by the fire, of the shawl she left behind. His voice trembled as he admitted the truth he had never said aloud, that he feared he was a man who could not hold anyone long, that grief had carved him hollow, leaving only doubts. Ayanna listened, her eyes steady, her braids glinting in firelight. She offered no comfort, only presence, and somehow that was more than pity could ever be. Their silences changed. No longer heavy, no longer weapons. They became a language of their own. The brush of hands when passing a cup, the quiet rhythm of chores shared, the way he fetched extra firewood without her asking, the way she laid out his tools before he mended the fences. Each gesture was a sentence. Each pause was a promise. But the prairie held dangers that did not sleep. One night, as the sky deepened into indigo, hoofbeats thundered near. Elias stiffened at once, his hand falling to the rifle by the door. Lantern light revealed figures, riding hard, and at their head was the bloated trader, the man who had once tried to barter Ayanna like a mule. His voice rang out, slurred with fury but sharp with intent. "Crowe, you got what's mine. Hand her back or we'll burn you out." Elias's chest burned hot with rage. He stepped outside, rifle raised, his body drawn tall against the starlit prairie. "She's not yours. Never was. Ride on before you meet the ground." Laughter echoed, cruel and careless. Men dismounted, torches in hand. Flames licked high as they thrust fire toward the cabin's edges. Smoke curled into the night sky, the smell of pitch and destruction filling the air. The trader shouted, spittle flying, "She's property, bought and sold. You can't keep her from me." Elias's finger tightened on the trigger, but before he could fire, Ayanna stepped out beside him. Her eyes burned brighter than the torches, her voice ablade. "No," she cried, her words clear, steady, unbroken. "I am not yours. I am not his. I am my own." The men faltered, their cruelty dimmed by the strength in her voice. The trader snarled, raising his torch higher, but Elias fired then, the shot splitting the night, shattering glass from the trader's lantern. Flames burst but died quick, scattered across wet earth. Chaos erupted as men scrambled, some firing. Shots into the dark, others stumbling back. Smoke seeped through the cabin walls, embers crawling up the wood. Elias and Ayanna moved together, side by side, buckets of water dousing sparks even as they defended their home. She reloaded the rifle, with swift hands passing it to him without fear, her braid swinging as she turned. He took the weapon, fired again, and watched one man fall screaming into the dirt. The night became a blur of fire and steel, of voices rising and falling. Ayanna shouted in her tongue, her words carrying like thunder, defiance ringing stronger than the storm that had trapped them days before. Elias felt her presence at his back, unyielding, a strength he had never known. She fought not as one needing rescue, but as one who refused to yield an inch of ground. At last, the trader cursed. His courage broken, he mounted his horse with shaking hands and rode into the dark, his men scattering like leaves in wind. The flames sputtered low, smoke clinging heavy but beaten. Elias lowered the rifle, chest heaving, lungs scorched by smoke. Ayanna stood beside him, her face smudged with ash, her eyes alive with fire. For a moment neither spoke, both too breathless to shape words. The cabin smoldered, but still stood. The night was quiet again, save for the crackle of dying embers. Elias turned to her. Their eyes met, and in the glow of firelight he saw it at last. Not a burden, not a shadow of his past, but a woman fierce enough to carve her place beside him. A second chance, raw and unasked for, but no less real. She held his gaze, unflinching. No words passed between them, but none were needed. In the fire's glow, in the ruin of smoke and danger, something bound them together stronger than any vow.